For more on what is at stake here from the Trump-Putin meeting and the U.S. economic agenda at G20, we are joined now from Washington by former Undersecretary of State Alan Larson and Daniel Griswold, co-director of the program on American Economy and Globalization at George Mason University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. It's good to talk to you. Alan, just give us a status of the state of affairs between U.S. and Russian relations right now as President Trump is about to meet President Putin for the very first time.
Relations between Russia and the United States are at a very, very low level right now. There are lots of problems. We need greater cooperation from Russia in dealing with ISIS in Syria. We need a stronger alignment on dealing with the threat posed by North Korea. And we want to send a message about the unacceptability of Russian intervention in our election process, as well as the election process of other countries.
Daniel, who's got the leverage here between the two of them? We saw that initial photo, looked cordial. They were getting ready to meet later, and we are expecting that any moment. But how do you stack up, whether it's economic or political leverage between Putin and Trump?
Yeah, and of course they're all intertwined. I think this is an important meeting, but the president has made his task more difficult by U.S. trade policy. We've picked gratuitous fights on trade with key allies. You saw President Putin in an article trying to drive a wedge between the United States and the other G20 countries on trade, and he's got a point. You know, the U.S. should be leading on trade at the G20 summit, and yet we're talking about protectionist measures while the rest of the G20 is ready to move ahead on trade liberalization. The EU-Japan free trade agreement announcement is huge. That's going to put U.S. exporters at a disadvantage, and of course, we could have had duty-free access to the Japanese market, but the Trump administration unwisely walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
So, Alan, is Merkel's job here to avoid a repeat of the G7, where it appears that the U.S. is relatively isolated and days later we do something like pulling out of Paris, as we did in that case? I mean, how much is her responsibility maintaining overall cohesion?
Well, as the chair of the meeting, she is trying to maintain cohesion, get an acceptable result, find that area of common ground where leaders can agree that they share an interest and they share an assessment of the path that needs to be followed. And that will be true on trade. It will be true on the importance of economic recovery in the world overall. And it will be true with respect to emerging threats, like the one that has come from North Korea and the launch of its intercontinental ballistic missile.
Dan, you mentioned the trade posture of the United States. Thought it was interesting to read in the FT today what Europe is preparing in retaliation. Potential restrictions on U.S. whiskey, bourbon from Senate Leader Mitch McConnell's Kentucky, orange juice, dairy products. Is this a new posture, an emboldened EU after the Macron victory in France? And you think they could actually go through with something like this if the U.S. imposes steel tariffs on its imports?
Yeah, the answer is a resounding yes. The European Union will retaliate against the United States if we impose tariffs on imported steel. The European Union is one of our main suppliers of steel. They're a reliable supplier, a NATO ally. But if we use national security as a cloak to protect our steel industry, they will retaliate, not just against U.S. steel, but against orange juice, and as you mentioned, bourbon and potatoes and things like that. They did that in 2002 when under George W. Bush, we raised tariffs on steel. So no, they're ready to retaliate. And this is another example of the Trump administration's trade policy complicating our important foreign policy work. As Mr. Larson pointed out, we've got huge items on the agenda like Korean nuclear weapons, terrorism, Russian ambitions, reviving the global economy. And yet the Trump administration's trade policy, from steel to walking away from TPP, is making all that more difficult than it should be.
Alan, as far as Putin goes, specifically, as we await video from this bilateral, I've heard some analysts this morning argue that, in their view, Putin always has the upper hand in a bilateral because of his tenure as a leader because of his experience in the secret services, because of his schooling in psyops. Do you buy that?
Well, I think he's a very, very clever man and a very clever negotiator. And I think to deal with him, you have to be prepared. You have to understand his tactics and his objectives, and you have to understand yours, and you have to really understand, how to conduct that negotiation. I think that Secretary Tillerson at the president's side will be very helpful in this regard. He has had a lot of experience in dealing with Russians, and he has made it very clear in his remarks since becoming Secretary of State that Russia needs to change direction, and Ukraine is one of the examples of that, where Russia not only seized Crimea but is continuing to intervene in eastern Ukraine. So Putin should never be underestimated, but he shouldn't be seen as a Superman either.
Well, we will await the first photos and any headlines we get as this meeting is set to kick off this hour. Gentlemen, thank you.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.